Now, before the festival of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet. You also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you should also do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen. But it is to fulfill the scripture, the one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I tell you this now before it occurs, so that when it occurs you may believe that I am he. Very truly I tell you, whoever receives one whom I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me."
John 13, the Last Supper, recalls in some ways the other accounts of the Last Supper, but is so strikingly different. Yeah. Starts out with that notion of the hour that now is beginning at the end of the fourth gospel. It's a very long hour.
It's a very long hour
lasts,
with many speeches.
Yeah, for chapters on end. And it begins with this episode of Jesus at dinner with his disciples at a slightly different time from what we find in the Synoptic Gospels, right? Because there he's celebrating a Passover meal, and here he has to be dining the day before the Passover meal is celebrated, because he dies at the time of the Passover lamb is sacrificed, according to chapter 19. Yeah. So we have that difference with the Synoptic Gospels, but the major difference is the absence of any account of the institution of the Eucharist. Yeah. There's no breaking of the bread, no reference to the cup whose wine is poured out, and the symbol of the blood poured out to establish a new covenant. The kind of language we get in all three synoptics and also in Paul, 1 Corinthians. So that's a striking difference, and that's always intrigued me. I think it's intrigued the whole history of Johannine scholarship. Is there a hidden allusion to the Eucharist here, or is it something that John wants to avoid in some way or other? So that's a problem. I don't know if
that's a huge problem, to which I have come down firmly on both sides, depending on which time you catch me. Interestingly, one of the kind of Baptist-like churches, Church of the Brethren, left wing of the Reformation, because we don't believe in sacraments, supposedly we believe in ordinances. Notice that Jesus did 3 things at the Last Supper, and don't worry about the fact that 2 of them were in the Synoptics and 1 of them in John. So when they do Lord's Supper, they do cup, bread, and foot washing. And is John is John proposing an alternate way of remembering him, or is he simply adding to what's already there, or is this doing something ethical without any liturgical consequences whatsoever? That's my first question. So I'm answering your question with a question. Sometimes I think that he's already given us the bread from heaven and the true vine, and that we're going to have water and blood on the cross, and so he doesn't need to put it in here, because implicit behind the whole story is a kind of sense that life is lived sacramentally. And that still doesn't stop me puzzling, okay, but why not also here? This looks like the place where you could bring all that together in ways that would be consistent with tradition and with his own theology. I don't see any particular reasons he should get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right, and I've had the same sort of ambivalence about where to come down on all of this. I guess my way of thinking about it right now hinges on my belief that John does know the synoptics. And does think that he's able to do a better job of conveying the significance of Jesus than his fellow evangelists have done. I think he's really intending to write something like Scripture, something that will embody the divine revelation.
The witness, yeah.
And so when he comes to tell the story of the Last Supper, he's confronted with this problem. Do I tell what I've already alluded to back there in chapter 6, with the bread and the blood
munching
and the
bread.
flesh,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And stuff that I'll get to again when I come to describe the crucifixion? Or do I want in some ways to do what the function of those Last Supper stories is in the Synoptic Gospels, to convey here in some profound way the meaning of the death of Christ? And if I focus on the ritual action, I may be distorting the picture, or I may not be capturing the full flavor of what I want to convey. I think that's something of how he was approaching the issue.
So in a way, for the early reader or listener, they know that other story, and then they say, ah, yes, but here's something, here's another way to think about it.
That's right. You see, I think if John knows the other Gospels and assumes his readers
also,
or hearers
have heard. That's what I'm wondering.
Then he's probably playing on their expectation that there's going to be an account of the Last Supper here, an account of the ritual that they now perform in some fashion or other, and they're going to be struck by its absence.
Which is what he does with the Old Testament.
That's right.
That is, he said, we're going to start in the beginning, or we're going to have the manna, and they think they know how the story is going, and then it switches on them.
Yep, so it's another case of this genre bending. So he's bending the synoptic genre here in a very significant way. So what do you have instead of the breaking of the bread? You have this symbolic, prophetic action of Jesus, where he girds himself like a slave. He takes the position of a slave. Oh, now that has resonance, doesn't it? If you think back to Paul and the famous hymn in Philippians that talks about the incarnation and death of Christ, talking about him as being in the form of God, but not considering equality with God something to be held onto, but instead emptying himself and taking the form of a slave and dying a death on a cross. Another one of these many points of comparison and possible contact between John and the Pauline tradition. So Jesus here takes the demeanor and the function of a slave, and this is why. I mean, there's a status reversal going on. The disciples don't want him to be
hugely,
in that position.
yes, absolutely.
My God, our
Absolutely.
master,
Don't do this to
our
me.
teacher,
Absolutely,
don't
It's like
become a
the
slave
child
for us.
seeing the father weep. Don't do that.
Yeah,
That reverses our roles. You're supposed to be strong.
That's right. Yeah. So there's an interesting verisimilitude there that reflects the kind of social structures of both Jewish and Greco-Roman society within which this would have worked. So the disciples don't want to see Jesus. And you've been pushing in our conversations all along the sort of cost of discipleship theme. And this is another case where it's coming at you in a very strong way. Jesus then engages in the foot washing, and then you have this curious dialogue with Jesus and Peter, where Peter finally accepts the foot washing.
Resistantly.
Resists it, but finally accepts it. And Jesus tells him about being washed and just having to be tidied up, in effect. So there's probably some allusion here to the baptismal.
Probably, well, I would think.
Even though that hasn't happened for the disciples in a narrative way. But again, this is one of those cases where you have to transfer into the story world things that are coming from the real world of the evangelist. And so he's saying there's something beyond the baptismal experience. The baptismal experience is good, it's foundational, it's basic, but there's something a little bit more than that. And the more has to do with the example of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so finally what this is all about, and that's right here on the surface of the text. You don't have to invoke any special knowledge or special theory. Jesus says he's giving an example.
Absolutely.
An example of self-giving service. Yeah. So if we're right that this story functions in John in a way similar to the fashion in which the Last Supper stories function in the Synoptic Gospels, that's pretty critical. And John is saying, I can make that function work better by showing that Jesus is an example of self-giving service. And if that's right, then I think we begin to get the solution to the problem of what the content of Revelation is in John. The content of Revelation, as we heard from way back in chapter 3, and seeing Jesus, the Son of Man, like the serpent hung up on a cross, has to do with the cross event. Everything has been pointing forward to that.
Yeah.
And this little story of Jesus giving his self-giving, servile attention to his disciples also points forward. And it's saying, that's what that cross is all about. And if we see that, then we begin to get it.
Yeah, and the cross is not only has not only theological resonance, but in practical resonance. That is, how does one live out the cross, not just how does one believe the cross. So that's not unimportant either.
That's right. And I think all of the major early Christian theologians keep those things in intimate contact.
Yeah, they do.
The objective event of God's interaction with human life and human suffering and human sin through Jesus, and the way in which Jesus, in his behavior as a human being, exemplifies how one relates to God. We've come to appreciate that so much more in dealing with Paul these days, where the faith of Jesus Christ is not the faith that Jesus is the Christ, but the fidelity that Christ himself showed to God. See that in the Epistle to the Hebrews, and I think we see it here in John.
Yeah.
And here, however, it's expressed not so much in terms of faith, but in terms of love.
Yeah. The rap that John gets, partly on the basis of John 13, is that while, like all the synoptic tradition, he believes very strongly in the love of Christians for others, the others are family others, church others. That in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have love of the neighbor, then love of the enemy, then love of the larger world. John, it's the love one another. Do you think that John's gospel is finally limited to intra-community, intra-church love as the commandment?
Yeah, there isn't any explicit command to love enemies,
Right,
as there is in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is why we have a Bible that has both John and the Sermon on the Mount are there, to make sure we have
Both sides.
Both sides. Yeah. But insofar as what we get in John is a message of love, it's reinforced in several ways, some of which could arouse the same kind of suspicion that you've just put on the table. We have the example of self-giving love for his friends at dinner here in John 13. We have the explicit command to love as he has loved later on in the chapter, referring back to that example of servile love, but also ahead to the
cross itself.
The cross.
Yeah.
And then we have the proverb in John 15, after the vine and the branches parable, where Jesus says, "Greater love than this hath no man than that he give his life for his friends."
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. Which, interestingly enough, is a proverb that we find in Greek philosophy all over the place. So it's out there.
Yeah.
So one could read all of these things in a restrictive way as relating only to the Christian community. But then I think you have to see this in the light of the whole of the gospel, which from the prologue on has been talking about God's universal salvific will.
Yeah.
His sending of his Son into the cosmos, into the world, in order to redeem it. And God so loved the world.
Yeah, so the promise is that Christ dies for the sake of the world, not just for the sake of the church.
I think that's right, and that's certainly what I would like to believe.
Me too.